And I'm going to share. All right, can everybody see the presentation? You can see it, Brittany, in your end. That's okay. Yes. Yes, and if you feel comfortable or you want to stand there, I have your presentation moved up.
Can you read your
Okay.
stuff? Yes.
Okay, cool.
Can you read it?
Okay.
I'll do my best.
Please keep the chat informed of Brittany. If there's any technical difficulties that arise throughout this meeting, if there's any issues with audio or what have you, please let us know so we can address those sooner rather than later, and so that everybody's getting the information that they need. Thank you so much. All right, Stephanie.
Well, hello everyone. Rob did a great job introducing this meeting today, so I'll skip all that and just jump right into it. Slide. So the purpose of this meeting is to present the case for supporting and supporting data.
Sorry, I realized that the notes, that's what you were saying, Brittany. The notes were up, sorry. Okay.
Back one slide. So to present the case and supporting data for removing the fish tumors and other deformities beneficial use permit for the Buffalo River area of concern. Next slide. This is a brief outline of what I'll be talking about today. First, introducing Great Lakes areas of concern, what are AOCs, beneficial use impairments, and the process of the removal of them, remedial action plans, specifically getting into BUI 4 removal criteria and the actions and assessments that were conducted to evaluate readiness for removal. And then towards the end, we'll have time for questions. Slide. So in 1972, under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, 43 of the most polluted locations around the Great Lakes were identified as areas of concern, as noted in this image. An AOC is a location that has experienced environmental degradation, mostly due to former heavy industry and manufacturing that resulted in the degradation of natural resources in these areas. There are 26 AOCs in the US and 12 in Canada, and then 5 of those are binational, which means that they're managed by Canada and the US. And only 9 of 43 have been removed from the list, 6 of those being in the US. Specifically getting into New York State AOCs, there are 6 AOCs in New York going from west to east. We have Buffalo River, the Nag River, 18 Mile Creek, the Rochester Embayment, Oswego River, and St. Lawrence River. Oswego River was delisted in 2006, and the Rochester Embayment is in the process of being delisted currently. The Buffalo River AOC extends along the historically industrialized portion of the river, beginning at the mouth and continuing approximately 6 miles up to Bailey Avenue Bridge. It also contains the entire 1.4 mile city ship canal located adjacent to the river, that straight line. And the large extent of the Buffalo River and city ship canals in the AOC boundary is designated as a federal navigation channel, which is maintained and dredged by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to a depth of 22 to 23 feet. So why is the Buffalo River an area of concern? The industries that once dominated the shores of the river contaminated sediments with polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, and heavy metals such as lead and mercury, along with industrial organics and pesticides. In addition, the city of Buffalo has built a combined sewer and stormwater system that outfalls into local water bodies, including the Buffalo River. And so raw sewage would directly enter into the waterways, specifically during storm events. Everything, stormwater and sewage, would just outfall directly together. And this became more common as the city grew and expanded, as did the volume of sewage. So the Buffalo River experiences those impairments in the past. So here's a larger map of the Buffalo River area of concern. Here in the blue, you see the AOC boundary. And then the pink color is the federal navigation channel that is dredged by the Army Corps of Engineers. Getting into beneficial use impairments.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. So, the International Joint Commission, IJC, defined 14 potential beneficial use impairments that an AOC can have under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Beneficial use impairments represent different types of significant environmental degradation. And then of the 14 possible BUIs that the IJC defined, we had 9 that were identified in the Buffalo River AOC. And here I have a list of all 14, and according to the key, the blue, which if you can't see it, that's okay because they're not applicable to Buffalo River. They're not impaired or not applicable. And then for green, we have BUIs that have been removed. Here we have 5 of them. And then currently in yellow, we have the fish tumors and other deformities, removal in progress. And then there are 3 remaining BUIs that are impaired in white. We have restrictions on fish and wildlife consumption, degraded fish and wildlife populations, and bird or animal deformities or reproduction problems. I would like to clarify that BUIs are different from water quality impairments as defined under Section 303D of the Clean Water Act. And in most cases, BUI removal is not directly related to or contingent upon the 303D status of the AOC water body. Next slide. So here we have the BUI process, the step-by-step process from identification to removal of BUIs. So BUIs for the Buffalo River were originally identified in 1989 in the Remedial Action Plan, which I'll get into in the next slide. If the causes were identified, they were listed in the Remedial Action Plan. For BUIs where causes were unknown, additional assessments were recommended to determine the causes. So once a cause is identified, you can advance the slides. So once causes are identified, criteria was developed for cleanup and restoration for each of those BUIs. Next is to mitigate, assess, and monitor to ensure restoration targets and criteria are met. And then the BUI can be removed where a report is developed that makes the case for why and how the BUI criteria is met, meaning that there's no longer any impairment to the specific beneficial use. And we're currently in that process for this BUI. And then so when all BUIs of the AOC are removed, the AOC can be delisted. Next slide. So back in the 80s and 90s, through collaborative process, RAPs were developed to provide the roadmap for restoring the beneficial uses and ultimately delisting the AOC. In 1987, a group of concerned citizens, scientists, and stakeholders, along with New York State DEC, formed the Buffalo River Remedial Advisory Committee, the RAC. The fish tumors and other deformities BUI was originally listed impaired in the RAP due to contamination in river sediments, likely from upland legacy and industrial sites and combined sewer overflows. Sorry. So the plan for addressing those proposed actions to restore the BUIs include cleanup of contaminated sediment, address the upland sources of contamination, and then implementation of the Buffalo Sewer Authority's long-term control. Next slide. So finally, we get to the removal criteria for BUI 4, which is that the analysis shows that prevalence of neoplastic liver tumors found in brown bullheads within the AOC is not significantly higher than those found within a designated comparable control site. So in 2023, the Buffalo River RAC formed a subcommittee to review this existing criteria and examine whether the data indicated that the criteria was met. So here's that figure again. We are in the 4th step to assess, mitigate, and monitor. Specifically for the fish tumors and other deformities, the RAP identified the need to mitigate upland sources of pollution, clean up of contaminated sediments, and address CSOs. And then we can go on to examine and assess the prevalence of liver tumors and brown bullhead. Next slide. So this one is just to show you upland site remediation was conducted through state remedial programs. This is a separate effort from AOC activities, but this addressed some of those direct sources of upland contamination that were entering into the river. Remediation sites are in orange, and you can explore this map in our DEC info locator. The link is at the top bar right there. And so the intent of this is to show, as I mentioned, direct sources were taken care of, and so they are not contributing to the Buffalo River. But it's not it doesn't mean that all of these sites were directly contributing to the river. So I just want to make that clear. Now we go to the Great Lakes Legacy Act. So a lot of the cleanup effort was done through the Great Lakes Legacy Act and also dredging by the Army Corps of Engineers. This effort was led by the Great Lakes Legacy Act and was passed by Congress in 2002 for the purpose of cleaning up contaminated sediments within Great Lakes AOCs. Specifically for the Buffalo River, the Legacy Act funded baseline sampling to evaluate the effects of sediments in the Buffalo River ecosystem, feasibility study for remedial action, remedial design report, and a major portion of dredging activities and other restoration efforts. The map summarizes remedial and restoration activities under the Legacy Act and includes habitat restoration, capping, and dredging. Over 1 million cubic yards of sediment were removed from the Buffalo River through combined efforts of the project coordination team funded by the Legacy Act and the Army Corps of Engineers Operation and Maintenance Funds. Lastly, there was monitoring that was conducted 2 and 5 years after remedial activities. This was in 2017 and 2020/2021. And here we have a very simple outline of some of the work that was done specifically for this BUI. So in 2008, baseline data was collected there was a collection of brown bullhead done in 2008. And then in 2011 through 2015, that was when all of the Legacy Act, the major portions of the Legacy Act were completed. And then in 2021, we collected 50 brown bullhead from the Buffalo River as part of the post-remedial monitoring. The monitoring work was intended to evaluate whether dredging of the sediments improved the water and habitat quality. We did not look for liver tumors in brown bullhead in 2017. That's the year 2, because we determined that it was too soon after remedial activities to see any real significant change. So this next map shows.
Real quick, the year 2 being too soon, could you say like a quick statement about why is that too soon?
I'll get into it later too, but basically that because right after any sort of remedial work, you're potentially re-exposing organisms to contaminated sediments that were buried, and so that can cause a dip in recovery soon after any sort of dredging or restoration, and then you'll see in later years a recovery, and you get to see the true benefits of that dredging.
Thanks. I just thought that
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. So here, this is a map of the Buffalo River and the control site that the data was compared to. In the BUI criteria, it says that we compared to a control site, and that is Long Point Inner in Ontario. So as I mentioned, 50 fish were collected from Buffalo River, and also 50 fish were collected from Long Point Inner Bay in 2019. So next slide. Here's a map indicating exactly where in Buffalo River, what zones the fish were collected from. You can see it includes City Ship Canal, and here's a photo of a USGS technician collecting stunned fish using the electroshocking process to collect fish. Next, we get on to the data. So this data shows specifically stats on the fish that were found to have tumors. So we can see that 30 out of 50 fish had tumors from the Buffalo River, and then 2 of the fish had tumors and Long Point Innervay, the control site. I also included some data from 2008, but it's not directly comparable because there was a lot less fish that were collected in 2008. Methods were slightly different, but it's just to show some of that information. And also, we didn't collect the age of the fish in 2008, so it's only partially useful. But as you can see from Buffalo River fish, the 3 fish that were found to have tumors were 9 years old, and then the fish that were found to have tumors in Long Point Innervay were 10 years old. The big question is whether there's a significant difference between these 2 sites. Now the samples were pretty small, 50 fish is a small pool of data, so we turned to statistics. Next slide. So now we're going to switch over to Dr. Rudder to provide his analysis and findings.
Hey folks, thanks for bearing with some of the technical hiccups that we've experienced. But I'm going to switch my screen over to the slides that Dr. Rudder has prepared. And Dr. Rudder, feel free to test out your mic, make sure that everybody can hear you as I set this up.
Can everybody hear me?
We can hear you in this room. Can everybody
Okay, that's
virtually?
good.
Okay, full screen mode. All right, can everybody still see the slides that I have up now? Yep.
Okay,
and
well, thank you everybody for allowing me to talk tonight. And my goal here is to have an equation-free talk. Talk mostly about the concepts of the methods and the results of what I did. Next slide, please. A little bit about myself. I'm currently an associate professor of statistics at Penn State Barron in Erie, Pennsylvania. Many years ago, I received a PhD in fisheries from Michigan State University. And while I was there, I also picked up a master's degree in statistics while at MSU. So that's kind of my academic background. Next slide, please. I've been working on bullhead tumors just after I started at Penn State Barron in around 2004. And in 2010, I published a paper in the Journal of Great Lakes Research entitled A Statistical Approach for Establishing Tumor Incidence Delisting Criteria in Areas of Concern, a case study. And that was done for the Presque Isle Bay area of concern. And so I was brought into that project relatively early because they wanted some statistical expertise on how the best way to approach the problem. And we discussed it for a long number of years and looked at different methods and finally settled upon something that I think does a good job of answering the question that we're trying to get at. And so the ultimate result of that was that in 2013, the work done in that paper was used to help delist Presque Isle Bay as an area of concern. And that is a peer-reviewed paper, and it has been cited 15 times in Google Scholar, according to Google Scholar. I will say that 2 of those are my own papers or papers I've collaborated with people with, so it's really 13 other people have at least referenced that work in looking at how to measure and how to evaluate bullhead tumor incident rates. Next slide, please. I've done numerous collaborations in the Chesapeake Bay with Fred Pinckney, who is from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have a number of papers published about data collected in that area, comparing different locations. I also assisted the Niagara River AOC fish tumor beneficial use impairment removal that happened in 2015. So the techniques I'm going to talk about tonight have been used in various formats in a number of places. So hopefully we can continue to use those here and see how those results work. Next slide, please. So the goal, as was stated earlier, is we want to compare liver tumor incidence on bullhead collected in the Buffalo River to the control site. And that control site is Long Point Innervay. And going back to that work I did in 2010, bullhead were collected at a number of sites, both in Lake Erie and areas adjacent to the Lake Erie watershed. And we quickly decided that comparing fish in Lake Erie to things that weren't in the watershed was not a good idea. So we eliminated those data, and that left us about 5 sites in Lake Erie that weren't Presque Isle Bay, that weren't areas of concern. And the question became, well, should those really be reference sites? And so one of the first tasks was to do an analysis to see, hey, do any of these other sites have elevated liver tumor rates? And at the time, we were looking at both liver and skin tumor rates. And it turned out that the only site that we sampled in Lake Erie was the Log Point Inner Bay site. And so that quickly became the only option for a control site, kind of like what is the background tumor rate in Lake Erie. And so we use that for Presque Isle Bay, and since the Buffalo River is part of the Lake Erie watershed, it seems an appropriate choice for that as well. Next slide, please. An important piece of the statistical work is the assumption that as fish get older, tumor rate should increase. And that kind of makes sense, because in lots of animals, including human beings, the older you get, the higher the probability of having a tumor of some nature. So it's really, really important that you take into account the age of the fish. And I put older in quotes because age can be represented in lots of ways. Aging fish is not an exact science. Sometimes length might be a better representation of age. Sometimes weight might be a better representation of age. In this particular example, we had otoliths, which certainly did help with coming up with better ages, but we're never really sure before we look at the data what might describe what an older fish is. So it turns out, spoiler, the answer is age, but we always want to look to see what those are. And part of the reason why that's important is because when you're sampling bullhead, there's no guarantee you're going to get the same age fish in each sample. There could be differences based on the locations. One location might have older fish than the other. You could get luck of the draw that day. You just happen to catch a bunch of younger fish that don't have a lot of tumors because they happen to be young. And other sites you might catch older fish that have just naturally have a higher probability of a tumor. And so you have to take that into account. And so I've always said it's important to compare apples to apples. You want to make sure that you take into account the demographics of your sample so that you eliminate any bias that might be in the data, because one sample might have had older fish and one sample might have had younger fish. You want to compare something that is somewhat age independent. And so that's a really important goal when doing this analysis. Next slide, please. And so here's some old data. Very old data of probability of skin tumors and this was from Presque Isle Bay. As you can see, as the age increases, the probability of a tumor increases. And so it's a pretty strong relationship. I would like to point out this was a really large data set, so we had lots of fish, which was really great. I'd like to also point out that those circles represent the sample size. So as you can see, we sampled mostly age 5, 6, and 7 fish. There were a few older fish. You can see, if you look really closely, you can see very small dots at 13 and 15 years of age that have no tumors. Those happen to be one fish. But you can see that as age increases, you can definitely see that tumor rates do increase. So taking that into account and accounting for that in your data is a really key component. And so I think this graph does a really nice job of showing that relationship does in fact exist. Next slide, please. So in order to actually model these tumor rates, I'm going to use a technique called logistic regression. That curve that you saw in the previous slide is often referred to as a logistic curve. It is especially useful in modeling binary outcomes, things that have a yes or no answer, or 0 or 1 answers. In this particular case, a fish is labeled as 0 if it doesn't have a tumor, and 1 if it has 1 or more tumors. So logistic regression is a great tool for that. If we were measuring something else, like say the level of contamination, and it was a number like 6 parts per million or something like that, logistic regression would not be appropriate, because it's really only good when there's 2 possible outcomes. And so we're going to use logistic regression. And as I said earlier, we're never really sure what the best estimator or what the best predictor of tumor rates is. So we look at a bunch of things. And so we look at age, and we look at length, and we look at weight, and we look at all combinations of those things. So I'll try a model with age and length. I'll try a model with age and weight. And sex can also be an important predictor. And there's been a couple areas in where sex has been an important predictor in terms of what tumor rates are. And so we also include that in as a possible covariate that could help predict what these tumor rates are. So the first thing we do is we try to figure out what is best at predicting these tumors. Next slide, please. And so the other thing that it's important to note is that the model assumes that if a bullhead lives long enough, it will have a liver tumor. It's just the way the model works. We kind of assume that mortality rates for reasons other than liver tumors are probably going to be different between the locations, and so we're really just looking at the tumor incidence and that of fish that are still alive, and some of those other mortality rates due to predation or fishing or just whatever are going to that will kind of be background noise, and we'll just take that into account in our estimates of uncertainty. And the reason why this is important is because it's impossible to target ages when you sample fish. So it'd be great if we could get a 50 age 7 fish, but that's asking a lot from a sampling design situation. So by taking into account the different ages, we're able to estimate the tumor rates at a particular age, at least from a modeling perspective. Next slide, please. So as I stated before, the thing we're trying to do is we're trying to find the best predictor. So we'll fit every possible combination of length, weight, age, and sex, and we'll see how well it fits the data. And I use a statistical tool called the Keki's information criteria, which assesses model fit. And so basically what it does is it determines how well the data fits the model and then penalizes it for the more parameters you have. Because in theory, if you throw a lot of different variables at the model will of course fit better, but you want to come up with the simplest model possible. And so the way Keki's information criteria works is the smaller the number, the better the fit of the data. And that's going to be important on the next slide. So if you show that, please. And so this is an abbreviated table because I didn't want to show you all of the possible combinations. But you can see that when you have age as the only predictor, it produced the smallest AIC number. Therefore, of all the predictors that we looked at, age was the best. You can see that when you added sex into it, it fit a little bit worse. And then when you had no predictors, it had a slightly higher number. And then as you can see, as you added length and weight, it became even worse in terms of goodness of fit. So clearly age is the best predictor of liver tumors in this data set that was used for the Buffalo River. And so we're going to talk about age moving forward. Next slide, please. And so there was 90, eventually we had 94 brown bullhead that was used in the data set once we had fish that had all their ages and all the pieces of information. The median age between the two data sets was 7. That's going to be important a little bit later on. Just want to point out it was 6 in the Buffalo River and 9 in Long Point Inter Bay. So the fish in Long Point are typically a little bit older than the fish in the Buffalo River. And there was 5 observed tumors amongst all of those fish. And so just basically a raw number is a 5.3% tumor rate, which is pretty low. And so beyond a statistical analysis, that's a pretty good number. We're going to see how that looks in a second, but just keeping that number in mind is important. Next slide, please. And so here's the kind of a similar plot to the one I showed a little bit earlier, but now this is for the data that was used for this analysis. And again, you can see that as the fish increase, the probability of a tumor does increase, and you can see there is a difference between the Buffalo River and that Long Point Inter Bay reference site, but the question is, it's statistically different. That is the question. If you could get to the point where you had really old fish, again, you can see that eventually we assume they have a tumor, but again, typically we don't sample fish of a particular age that gets that high so that they're always guaranteed to have a tumor. But that is how the model works. And again, the size of those circles represent the number of fish that were in each age group relative to the other samples. And I think the important thing to note about the slide is that we didn't, and this was mentioned before too, is that you didn't get any tumors until you got to age 9 fish. So the younger age fish, the majority of the fish in terms of their age, did not have tumors, which again is qualitatively a good sign, but we're gonna evaluate that quantitatively. Next slide, please. So what is the tumor incidence? And we talk about a tumor incidence, what number are we spitting out? And so the nice thing about logistic regression is it allows us to pick an age to use as a reference age, so we can, talk and compare things at the same age, because that's important. And what I've done in the past that seems to work real well is we use a typical fish. So in this case, we're going to use the median age of a fish in the entire sample, which is age 7. So in this case, we're going to talk about the tumor rates that would exist on essentially all age 7 fish that are in the area. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to describe the uncertainty in those estimates. And I think that's going to be important when we look at those, when we see the estimates in a moment. And so we're going to use the model to come up with estimates for tumor rates or tumor incidence for age 7 fish. Next slide, please. And so roughly for age 7 fish, in the Buffalo River, a point estimate would be 6.4%, where in the Long Point Interbase site, it would be 0.9%. And on a surface, it'd be like, wow, that's a big difference. However, you also have to include the uncertainty in those estimates, because every time you look at things like tumor rates, there is some level of uncertainty. And uncertainty comes just from the fact that there's random sampling involved, the fact that we have different age fish, and we're trying to account for that. And all that information together comes up with an estimate for what the uncertainty is. And so when you take that into account and you calculate a 95% interval for that, the probability of a fish having a tumor, normally you might hear the word confidence interval. This is a Bayesian approach, so they're not technically confidence intervals, they're prediction intervals. And so they're very similar to each other. That's a technical detail I don't want to go in here. But in the Buffalo River, the 95% prediction interval for tumor rates is 0 to 15.1%. Now, that's a pretty wide interval, but you'll notice that 0 is included in that. And so it is showing that tumor rates can vary a lot, just that natural variation. And when you look at the reference site, it goes from 0 to 5.8%. So again, 0 is included in that. Again, the interval is a little bit bigger for Buffalo River. One thing you find when you start looking at binary outcomes or things that can only be successes and failures, when you get near the extremes, when you get near 0% or you get near 100%, things kind of get a little strange in terms of confidence intervals, and they tend to be very big because there's no other place to go below 0. You can't have a confidence interval that falls below 0 and like -1%. That doesn't make sense. So you have to get that number a little bit higher in order to make sure you get 95% in there. So that's just a function of having values that are really close to 0. Next slide, please. So are these tumor rates different, or are they the same? And so this has been a question that bugged us for a very long time before I finally came up with a solution for Presque Bay. When you generally in statistics, you ask the question, are they different? And that's really what you say, are they different? And if they're not different, you typically say, well, we just don't have enough evidence to say that they're different. And one way to not have enough evidence is to not take a lot of samples. And so if you don't want to show that things are different from each other, take 10 samples. That's kind of cheating though. And so we don't want to do that. What we really want to do is we want to see if tumors are statistically the same, which is a slightly different question. And so we have to use a slightly different technique for that. Next slide, please. And so I did a lot of research, and I found something from the field of medicine called a TOST procedure, and TOST stands for 2-1 sample tests. And basically what that says is you can't show that tumors are greater than in one location, and you can't show that tumors are less than in the same location, that if they're not greater than and not less than, well, they must be statistically equivalent. And so the way to approach that is you create this 90% prediction interval that says if the tumor incidence is within, if there's the 90% chance that the difference in tumor incidence is within a certain level, then those two locations would be equivalent. So we're actually looking at the difference. What is the difference between the Buffalo River, so Buffalo River minus the reference Long Point Interbase site? What is the 95, or in this case, the 90% prediction interval about what that difference is? And if that difference is within a certain tolerance, then we can say that those are statistically equivalent to each other. And again, that takes into all the uncertainty that you have from the fact that you're doing random sampling in different ages and things like that. So that's the procedure that we use for this. Next slide, please. And so the procedure that has been developed is the first thing you do is you start to compare the site of interest to itself. So in this case, we compared the Buffalo River even though it's a typo in my slide, I apologize. That should be for the Buffalo River, not for Long Point Inner Bay. In order for Buffalo River to be equivalent with itself, the interval that would cause that to happen is negative 9.5% to 9.3%. And what I did in my paper in 2010 was, in order to take into account a little bit more uncertainty, we added 5% to that interval, and this has become pretty much a standard. And so that makes, and I also made the interval symmetric just to make it a little bit nicer. So when you take the difference between the Buffalo River site and the Long Point Inner Bay site, if that 90% prediction interval is between negative 14.5 and 14.5%, they would be considered statistically equivalent. Next slide, please. And so when you calculate that, it turns out to be that 90% prediction interval falls between negative 1.0% and 13.1%, and that's within that negative 14.5 to 14.5 interval. Therefore, the conclusion from a statistical standpoint is that the two locations are considered statistically equivalent. And therefore, that in a nutshell, that is the statistical conclusion when looking at the data. Next slide, please. I think it's good to point out there's some general comparisons looking at things. So Presque Isle Bay, when we looked at liver tumors collected over a number of years from 2002 to 2007, yes, the point estimate for the tumor rate is a little bit lower, but you can see that prediction interval is actually wider than what's in the Buffalo River. And so that was important. When we did Long Point Inner Bay from 2004 to 2007, again, the point estimate's a little bit higher than what we saw now, but again, that confidence interval is relatively large. So again, there's, even though the point estimates might be bigger, it's the confidence we have in those is well within what we've seen in other locations. Niagara River, from data collected from 2011 to 2013, again, a point estimate of 2.0, but the Buffalo River number is even smaller than what we saw in the Niagara River. I just want to point out that Niagara River, they used age 6 bullhead, and those are just the females, because in that particular data set, sex was an important predictor. We didn't see that in this one, but for the Niagara River we did. So even without the statistical analysis of doing that cost procedure, the data that we're seeing in the Buffalo River is very similar to what we're seeing in other locations. And obviously Presque Isle Bay has been delisted. So that's another strong signal that perhaps that BUI should be delisted. Next slide, please. Couple thoughts and notes before I end up and entertain any questions. I think it's important to note that those tumors were only seen on the older fish, which again is kind of what you would kind of assume from a relatively healthy site, that only older fish are going to have tumors. So from my fisher's background, that's a good sign. What's the lack of older fish in the Buffalo River compared to Long Point Inner Bay? Yes, they're both parts of Lake Erie, but on the other hand, we don't know what the predation is. We don't know what the fishing rates are. There's lots of other things that could explain that, and so it's something we're just not able to determine from the data that we have. And so that's why we use the logistic regression, so we can compare apples to apples and use age 7 fish from both locations. And again, the estimate of uncertainty, which I think is a much more useful thing to talk about than the point estimates, takes into account all of that natural variation and the sampling design, so we get an idea of how certain we are, or in this case, uncertain of what those tumor incidents could be. And next slide. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
We'll also have an opportunity for questions at the end.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Rutter, for once again lending your expertise, crunching the numbers, and distilling that information down to this public meeting, making it accessible to folks who aren't in the weeds. I guess we could maybe take 1 or 2 questions if you have them. I want to be respectful of Stephanie's time and the amount of other information that we have to get through today. So for those of you who are virtual, feel free to continue populating the chat. And if there's anybody here in person who might have a question or two.
Yes, I have a question.
Sure.
Say tumors higher level for an older fish.
Mm-hmm.
Is part of that because a fish in the Buffalo River AOC that's older than 67 years, could spend part of its life in more contaminated environment?
I'll actually be getting into that.
Yeah.
Next slide, so.
Okay. Well, then again, people who are attending virtually, feel free to continue populating the chat. And then for those who are in person, we will have some time.
The Downtown Central Library will be closing in 45 minutes. If you need a library card or other assistance, please see a staff member.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Pardon the interruption. We just got a reminder that we will be getting kicked out of here in 45 minutes.
Yes, real quick.
Yeah.
We really appreciate if people could sign in.
Yes,
And
please.
We do kind of track how many.
Absolutely. Yeah, your engagement is very not only valued, but critical to this process. So we will have some time for questions at the end. Dr. Rutter, if you don't mind sticking around until the end, that would be very much appreciated. Once again, thank you for presenting, and I'll hand it back over to Stephanie. Let me just bring back up two slides. Yes.
So we're getting into it. Yep, so there's the slide back to me. So when evaluating a BUI's readiness for removal, a subcommittee is formed from members of the RAC based on interest and expertise. As I mentioned earlier, the fish tumors and other deformities BUI subcommittee convened in 2023. And in our discussions, we determined to compile additional evidence that supports the findings within the statistical analysis, and the weight of evidence strengthens the case for removal. So we wanted to look beyond that. What sort of information supports the
Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that
removal is BUI? That's okay.
that everybody can see the full slides and not just. Is that better for everybody in person? Nope. Should have looked back. Apologies, folks. My job could have probably been done with a clicker with less error, but.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So the notes are showing on the virtual side, but not. Apologies, folks. Is that any
as I've
better?
mentioned, this is our first in-person since pre-pandemic. So,
Okay, so apparently they're not showing up virtually, but they're showing up here. And then, okay,
that's okay.
as long as everybody here can.
Can you drag make that section smaller, just
So I'm not even seeing that on my screen, which is interesting. Although,
Oh yeah, you can do that. If you just go over to the line.
get that out of here. All right.
Dr. Rutter touched on age. So the first weight of evidence is the correlation to age. So in animal tumor development strongly correlates with age. The 3 Buffalo River fish with liver tumors were 9 years old and would have been exposed to higher contaminant levels before remedial actions were taken, as you had suggested. So liver tumors in fish age 3 to 5 would have been a bigger concern because this indicates that there was significant exposure to contaminants that promote immediate tumor development versus just natural progression in the fish later life. And I want to show the next graphic. So this is kind of shows how, as I mentioned earlier as well, that when there was remedial dredging that occurred, that sediment is picked up, and in the Buffalo River, you would have seen undisturbed, cleaner sediment from upstream, Casanova Creek, Buffalo Creek, that would be coming down to the AOC. So when all that was dredged, the cleaner, newer sediment on top, along with the old contaminated sediment, was exposed into the water, and therefore exposing organisms within the Buffalo River to some of those historic contaminants. And at this time that this work was being done, those 9-year-old brown bullhead would have been young of year, so maybe just born, 1 year old. So that kind of leads us into the correlation to polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. And so extensive sampling, as an example, was done in the Black River AOC in Ohio. And that provides some of the best field-based evidence of the strong relationship between PAHs and liver tumors in brown bullhead. Black River is similar to Buffalo River, as it's surrounded by industry or was surrounded by industry and experienced PAH and heavy metal contamination. And in the 80s, some of the industry was shut down, and according to the research, in the short years after, PAH concentrations were significantly reduced, and this correlated with a major reduction in tumors found in the brown bullhead in Black River. And so a lot of that research has backed this link, and we see a similar pattern in Buffalo River, where tumor prevalence reduces as pH concentrations in sediments were reduced. Now, PAHs still could be entering the waterway, the big could, but this is like, could be from highway runoff, wood burning, and coal tar, and the method of transport would be through the CSOs. And so, as I mentioned, Buffalo Sewer Authority has been implementing the long-term control plan to limit the frequency and volumes of the city CSOs, including those that outfall into the Buffalo River, which I think there are 4 specifically in the AOC that are being used.
They're raining down on us at all times, so
Yeah.
to an extent, it's unavoidable.
So, and this figure is shows long-term trends of liver tumor prevalence in the brown bullheads. This goes back to I think 1983, where we can see the prevalence was up in 26-27%, and it has decreased since our 2021 sampling, where it's at 6.1. So similarly, we saw that same downward trend in pH concentrations in the Buffalo River. So next slide. Other factors that I wanted to touch on that are described a little bit further in the report are the N-nitroso compounds. These are naturally occurring carcinogenic compounds that can impact the health of fish and other organisms, and these come from sewage, decomposing plant matter, fertilizer, fish kills, hypoxic conditions, and low pH, some of these which the Buffalo River does experience. Another factor that could contribute to liver tumor development in brown bullhead are myoxazin parasites. These are parasites that live in the bile ducts of the fish. They're common in wild populations, and once they're exposed to a community, they're pretty much there to stay. So just to note, myoxazin parasites were found in Buffalo River fish back in 2008. So that's another piece of evidence. And then lastly, cyanobacteria as hypoxia, emerging contaminants such as estrogenic compounds, likely from pharmaceuticals, genetic and viral factors, and seasonal variation also affect the results of liver tumor prevalence. Again, with seasonal, you'll in the spring, if you do fall sampling, you'll likely see younger fish. If you do spring sampling, you'll see the previous year's fish older. So I wanted to mention or bring up the criteria again, because we covered a lot of information. So the removal criteria is that the analysis shows that liver tumors found in brown bullhead in the AOC is not significantly higher than those found within the designated comparable control site. So to summarize, I've discussed remedial activities implemented under the Legacy Act and the dredging that was conducted by Army Corps. I also talked about the monitoring that was conducted in 2021 after the completion of those remedial activities, and the statistical analysis to determine the significance of the tumor prevalence found in the Buffalo River. We've also covered how that removal criteria was met through that statistical analysis and the additional weight of evidence that explains that liver tumors can be formed from multiple factors, which more research is needed to determine specifically exactly why this happens. We have some idea, but we don't have a complete idea. So, but we are confident to say that liver tumors are not due to contamination of the river. And I also wanted to mention that the BUI report can be accessed through a link I think has popped into the chat.
Yes.
It's also online, and that goes into further depth than what we've covered today. So next steps. So the removal report will be available online until August 19th on Waterkeeper's website. After that and is completed, we will incorporate comments, we'll read them, we'll provide responses to them, and then submit that report to EPA. And then once they approve that removal, the BUI is removed. And here's also the link for the Belle River, the BUI removal report. And I just want to acknowledge the partner organizations that have contributed to the restoration of the Belle River AOC. A big thank you to them and others that may not be represented up here. It was definitely a huge group effort over the last few decades. So that is the end of our presentation. And if you have any questions now, take them.
Thank you again, Stephanie, and to Dr. Rutter for like weaving together these highly technical elements with like the weight of evidence approach and just being part of this process for a long period of time, because this has been a long process, as are all BUIs, but we prefer them not to happen in a vacuum. So we appreciate the members of the public who are in attendance today and know that, as Stephanie did outline, the public comment period goes through August 19th. So please, if you have any questions that come up after this public meeting is wrapped up, you can refer back to that link that Brittany put into the chat and that Stephanie already referred to open. Yeah, well, just submit your public comments. Cool. So if anybody has any comments or questions right now from the in-person folks or even virtually, we can hope to address those now. Yes.
Seems when you look at the, what's now 10 BUIs the total, that really, it seems like the two cornerstones was the sludge removal, the dredge, the approval there, and then reestablishing the habitat for fish and wildlife. And so now the remaining three, that's kind of like a follow-on natural adjustment to the improved environment. You have kind of a time frame on when you think you're looking at the reports on the remaining BUIs.
Yes, we have. So as part of that 2021 data, we did not only collect brown bullhead, we collected multiple different species of fish to address the other BUIs, which are basically on animal and fish populations and their health. And so we are still waiting on that data. It's nearly going to be available for us to review, I think, maybe by the end of this year. And then for the fish consumption BUI, we do want to do another round of sampling, and very important. And so after that, though, I think we have all of the data we need to start talking about the BUIs. It is a process. We have to get the subcommittee together, discuss, are we ready? Because we don't want to just take it lightly and just remove BUIs just to remove them. So
Of course. Yeah, it's an iterative process. There's a lot of back and forth. And I think some of the earlier estimates expected the AOC to be removed in like 2021, 2022. That doesn't mean that we haven't been making progress, but it shows that that sometimes questions come up that we can't anticipate. And we want to make sure that we're working with the best data that we can to remove these BUIs.
Is 2025 the year we hope to collect fish for fish contaminant?
Yep, and that is something, we're starting to plan for. The 2021 data, it shouldn't take this long, but actually there was delays of getting the fish to the lab because of the pandemic, so that definitely impacted our timeline for, or our projection for eventual delisting.
Just traveled more by truck than they did in all the years they lived in the river.
I think so. Probably more than some of us here today, right?
I do want to say, just as the rec chair, that this is no, Dr. Rutter was very clear. The statistics are great and everything, but you're really making a judgment based on, telling the community that, that things are no different than another site. Really what you're saying is like, this is probably the best we can do. It's still an urban river. There are still tumors that are going to occur naturally. There's nothing you can do about that, right? We have reasons to believe that we have improvement, but given that we have CSOs and given that there's natural occurrence, those statistics that Dr. Roger pointed out in the subcommittee meeting, that if we had a young fish, for example, the test would have failed. That would have been a bad.
Good afternoon. The library closes in just 30 minutes. Please see a
Just
staff
30
member
minutes.
for assistance. Thank you.
It wouldn't take us that long to get out of it.
Yeah, that's all right.
That would have been a bad thing, but what would you have done about it? Or if you had another older fish that was, would we have delayed this, this BUI and this whole delisting thing for 5 more years? I don't know. I mean, bottom line is, fortunately, we passed this test. But just as a member of the community, I look at this and say, I just don't think we're going to do much better. And at some point, you don't want to hold up to listing of the river to hope you get one fewer fish in the next sampling, which could be just sampling. So, this river is significantly better than it used to be, and this measures, I think, about as well as we're going to do. And that's why I think people on the rack, the statistics are great. I don't want to. I sometimes teach elementary statistics, and I couldn't follow everything there. But bottom line is, I know the guy knows what he's doing, but really the weight of evidence is really what the community sees and says, yeah, it was a good job. We've achieved something.
Yeah. That's why it's important too to weave those statistical elements into the weight of evidence approach, as it was, very well brought up in the subcommittee meetings. And I like the point that you made about looking at it from a historical lens, right? How far we've come, right? Yeah. So those are all important elements to this argument, I believe.
But could you do any better? I think the answer is probably not. Do you know what I mean? And how would you know? One fewer fish?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so I think you just have to look at it that way. There's nothing going to be perfect in this river. The habitat, yeah, we've done tremendous things with the habitat. Never going to come close like a native habitat. So the bottom line is, as a community member, the reason I'm willing to go along with it is just to be able to say, I just don't think we can do any better. We're doing a good job. And that's maybe the most important thing you can say beyond all the statistics. So.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Anything in the chat, Brittany, that we can address? Okay. All right. Well, maybe people will mull this over and then submit some robust public comments via the form on our website.
About all the BUIs, this one was there's a lot of thought.
I was going to say something similar, Dave. We went through this, DEC went through this a few years ago with the Niagara River. We didn't have a lot of public engagement, public participating in the public meeting, but the same thing, the deliberations that went into the data. I think throughout the Great Lakes Basin, this is a challenging BUI, and we've had Dave in the advisory committee. DEC, we work closely with Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper, other federal agency, technical experts at other federal agencies, just really looking at all the information that was out there. And we came to agreement that we've met the criteria, and as Dave said, it's, can we do better? I don't know, right. But we've come a long way, and the data show that. It's not an easy decision to make, but it was a very thoughtful process getting into this.
Yeah, definitely. We took our time with it. Any other? I'm going to keep probing. I don't want to pick on people.
You did a great job.
Yeah, Stephanie, excellent job.
I can't take all the credit.
Well, thank you for presenting. Yeah, and distilling all of this again, high level technical.
Clear, yes. Yeah, it is a lot of information, and I mean the weight of evidence. I'm trying to compile like 40+ years worth of research into 10 slides. So.
And if you want to sink your teeth into that, the report goes into detail a little bit more. So I would encourage those of you who did just have some time to digest everything that Stephanie said, also review the draft removal document. Oh yeah, I didn't take any pictures.
I got you.
Cool. How many people did we have virtually? Okay. Well, I think, if everybody's okay, we do have to be out of the room by 6:55, but I think Brittany and I can at least, stick around for a little bit as we pack down in case any other questions come up. I wish I could have grabbed some coffee. I got turned down at Tim Hortons. It's not, out of my control, but there are some tidbits at the back, as well as some reading materials about general Buffalo River stuff for anybody who is interested. And then for those of you who are in virtual attendance and want to read more about the Buffalo River, I would encourage you to visit Buffalo Niagara Waterkeepers. That's the first time I think I've ever done that. Yeah, and I work there. Buffalo Niagara Waterkeepers website for more information about the Buffalo River AOC, all the progress that has been done, and what we can look forward to in the future. So thank you, folks.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks.
How are you? Okay, I'm ready to show too.
Okay, nice to meet
Nice to
you.
meet you too. I'm